It is with great honor and respect that we welcome Lieutenant General Karen Gibson, U.S. Army retired. A distinguished leader, General Gibson has stood both in the trenches and at the forefront of pivotal moments in history. A seasoned combat veteran and three-star Army general. She's had 33 remarkable years of dedicated service in the U.S. Army, where she concluded her active duty as the Deputy Director of National Intelligence. Her vast experience also encompasses serving as the Director of Intelligence of U.S. Central Command. She masterfully managed intelligence operations that spanned the globe, deploying everything from clandestine operations to sophisticated sensors in space to support military initiatives. One of her proudest achievements was her role as Director of Intelligence for the multinational coalition aimed at defeating the Islamic State caliphate in Syria and Iraq. We have invited her to tell us about her last job, which was as the Sergeant of Arms, U.S. Senate, and she is one of 42 individuals in U.S. history to hold this position, only the second woman. So please, for this light interview, let's welcome a true patriot and trailblazer in national security, Lieutenant General Karen Gibson. So congratulations, congratulations. Everyone has heard an overview of your very non-traditional career. So before we get to your latest job, what comments and highlights would you like to tell us about your career that everyone's just heard about?
Well, thank you, Patricia, and thank you especially for the opportunity to speak before the Golden Gate Breakfast Club. It's a real treat and an honor for me. As I mentioned early on, before there were only a handful of people who'd logged on, I did grow up in Montana. I grew up in Montana in the 70s and early 80s, and it was certainly a very different way of life. And I know most of you know what it's like to grow up without social media or the internet or cell phones. But we also grew up without things like malls. We had a JCPenney's in town. It was on Main Street, and it was like a post office. You would go up to the counter and they would hand you the box of what you had ordered from the catalog across the counter. If you wanted to see clothes that were hanging on a hanger outside of the Tack and Western store or the ski clothes, you had to drive 2 to 3 hours to Helena or Billings to find a mall or a real clothing store. And if there was meat on the table, it was something my father shot and killed. That's just how we lived. We weren't poor. It's just the way that people lived in that place at that time. We were actually upper middle class. My father was a college professor, actually the dean of engineering at Montana State University. And I just really loved growing up in the Northern Rockies in that way. I was very good at math and I loved science. And so I thought that perhaps I also wanted to be an engineer. But when I went to summer school at Montana State University, I could leave my parents' house on a bicycle at 12:56 and make my 1 o'clock class. So I was not going to go to college there. And I applied to and was accepted at Purdue University to their College of Engineering. And my father said, "Congratulations, that's a great school. How are you going to pay that out of state tuition?" And he suggested that I consider ROTC. And it was, in fact, a great deal. For 4 years, they would pay my tuition and fees. And then as a result, I would owe them 4 years in the military. And then I could go on about the rest of my life, kind of figure out what I wanted to do as an adult. I had no intention of making it a career, none whatsoever. But I found that within a year of joining, I just absolutely loved it. It challenged every facet of my being, physically, mentally, emotionally, as a leader, as an individual, intellectually. And I particularly cherished the opportunity to serve alongside men and women who were similarly inspired to work together to do something very meaningful. And, at the end of the day, I decided there was nothing I would rather be than an American soldier. Got to jump out of helicopters, sleep on glaciers, jump out of airplanes, rappel from helicopters. 4 years turned into 33. I did 4 years in Korea with my family, the Republic of Korea, South Korea. I deployed to Iraq, to Afghanistan, to East Africa, Djibouti specifically. And at the time that I chose to retire, I had made the rank of 3-star general. There were about 1 million people in the Army, and there was one woman who outranked me. But I'd kind of run out of fun jobs. I truly relished the operational side of the Army, not the institutional side. And as a general officer, there were really very few of those jobs. And I realized when I left U.S. Central Command that the only battles I had in front of me were policy battles in the halls of the Pentagon, and that did not appeal to me. And so I chose to retire. And it was actually 2 years before the Army intended me to retire. They were a little upset. They said, there's only this one other female 3-star, Laura Richardson. She later was promoted to 4 stars. And they said, if you retire, that means Laura has to sit on all the promotion boards. And I was like, well, if you don't have enough women for the promotion boards, I kind of think that's your problem, not mine. And I chose to step down. I had my retirement ceremony on March 2nd, 2020. It was the last time many of my friends gathered together in one place. It was the last time most of them who'd flown there flew on a plane. We did not realize what was about to hit us. And when I signed out of the Army at the end of the month on March 31st, we were all wearing masks and plastic gloves because we weren't sure how this disease was transmitted. And my DD-214 discharge paperwork from the military says I left the Army with dirty teeth because the dental clinic had just closed and they could not see me for my final clearance. So all my plans for what I was going to do in retirement, I had a lot of foreign travel lined up that, fell to the side, obviously didn't happen. I began to teach a national security course at Georgetown University. I dabbled in consulting, did a little speaking, such as it was that first year at the Pentagon. And then I was presented with the opportunity to serve at the US Capitol in the role of Senate Sergeant at Arms in the wake of the January 6th attack on the Capitol. I performed in that role. It was very exciting, deeply fulfilling for 4 years, and the rest is kind of history. So that's a brief snapshot of my career. 37 years, I could talk all day, but I think I'll leave most of that.
We'd love the opportunity. Yeah. So let's go to, on the afternoon of January the 6th, 2021, you were at a meeting at the Pentagon, unaware of what was happening across the river at the Capitol. What did you feel once you learned what was going on, and how did that lead to your role as Senate Sergeant of Arms?
Well, obviously very shocked like most Americans. I would actually start it kind of on January 5th. I had driven to Fort Meade, Maryland, north of Washington, D.C. that day for a meeting at the National Security Agency. And on that drive, as we were going around the Capitol Beltway, there were convoys of vehicles coming down with flags. And I thought, these people are coming for the rally that's supposed to happen tomorrow. We knew it would be big. We did not know how it would end. And even the morning of January 6th, I was part of an advisory group that had been advised not to enter the district that day, just stay away. We don't know what's going to happen. But I went in the morning to get a COVID test on K Street in DC because I was kind of curious. And I document my life by taking a photo every day of something. And that day I did take some pictures of guys who were coming as individuals in MAGA hats and on scooters. And then as I went to the Pentagon, late morning, I started to see waves of people crossing the Memorial Bridge with flags. And I thought, they're headed to the mall for this rally. As you mentioned, Patricia, I spent most of the afternoon in the Pentagon, in what's called a SCIF, or a sensitive compartmented information facility, where you can discuss classified information. So I had no access to news or radio or the internet, had really no idea what was happening inside until I left late afternoon. And I think, like, all of us, I was aghast, appalled, sickened, angry. I could not believe this was happening in my own country. This is what happens in nations I deploy to. This is what I expect to see in Baghdad, maybe Kabul. I never thought I would live to see that on the steps of the US Capitol. So a few weeks later, it wasn't long, I read in the newspaper that the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi at the time, had tapped a retired general, Russell Honore, to do a quick survey of some of the security shortcomings in the House of Representatives. And I knew him, but he didn't know me. And a few days later, a mutual friend called me, a retired female general living in Dubai at the time, and said, hey, General Honore is looking for a retired intel female colonel to round out his team. One, all he hired on his team were men, and Nancy Pelosi would like to see a little more diversity on that team. So he'd like to find a woman with these skills. Two, all he hired were law enforcement, former law enforcement and security guys. They're saying it was an intel failure. Who's going to look at that part? And three, colonels are cheaper than generals. So, do you know a retired female intel colonel that could round out his team? So I made a list. And I looked at it and I thought, I think they all have full-time jobs right now. And I slept on it. And in the morning, I woke up and contacted Russell Honore and said, what about me? I would like to be on your team. Here's what I bring to the table. I'm right here in town, no travel involved. I could start tomorrow. And if there was ever anything I could do to ensure this never happened again, if I could contribute in any way, I would want to know that I had done that. And so he took me on his team as a contractor. Only time I've ever been a contractor. It was 5 weeks left on the contract at the time. And in my second week, well, as we went along, we were briefing various members and their staff on our preliminary findings. We briefed the Schumer team on about my 10th day on kind of what our initial assessment was in terms of security shortcomings and recommended fixes. A couple days later, I'm in the local grocery store pushing a cart through the produce aisle. Frankly, I was picking out citrus fruits for my cocktails, and my phone goes off. It's Senator Schumer's national security advisor, and he asked if I would consider becoming the Senate Sergeant at Arms, a position I had only just learned about and certainly never considered. I'm very, very glad I took that opportunity. I'm often asked, how did you get this job? Was it on like USA Jobs? The answer is no, but I tell young people who ask about this that I got this job for a couple of reasons. One, the first is networking. And many young people think networking is a dirty word. It's not. This is a form of networking. And if I had not been talking to the woman who was living in Dubai about some other things, I wouldn't have come to her mind when Russell Honore called her and said, hey, I'm looking for a female intel officer. So first was networking. Two is advocating for yourself. He didn't ask me. I went to him and said, I want to be on your team and here's what I can do. And then three, you never know when that briefing is going to matter. I had no idea when we spoke in a Zoom call to the Schumer team that they were thinking about what they were going to do to replace the Sergeant at Arms and actively looking for someone. And then fourth, just really keeping an open mind about unexpected, unanticipated opportunities. And I'm so glad that I did. It was a tremendous, tremendous experience and opportunity.
Can you please explain the responsibilities and complexities of this important job, which most of us had never even heard of before we?
That's right. Yeah, I was not familiar with it either at all. I think we kind of started to hear about it when they fired the entire security team after January 6th. So I'll start with a little history. Sergeant at Arms as a concept or a position in general actually has its origins in medieval Europe. Richard the Lionheart took sergeants at arms as part of his personal bodyguard on the Crusades. And I think it was Henry V, one of those, long ago 15th century kings of England who established a position of sergeant at arms to secure the English Parliament. And so when we created our system of government, so unique in its inception, we did copy a few things from that British government we broke away from, like a bicameral, legislature. And one of the things we copied was to have a sergeant at arms responsible for security. So just a little more, I'll squeeze in, even though it wasn't part of the question, a little more American history there. Everyone knows we declared our independence on July 4th, 1776. That's what we celebrate every July 4th. We didn't earn our independence until 1781, when the British surrendered at Yorktown. And then we began to operate in this kind of loose, not very federal system under the Articles of Confederation. And it didn't take long to see that that was not going to work. So they had the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. And after 2 years of drafting and ratification, our current system of government actually began in 1789, not 1776. And as part of that, the founders who drafted the Constitution, they envisioned that the legislature would actually be the most powerful part of the government. That's Article 1 of the Constitution, governs the House and Senate. The executive branch, the presidency, is Article 2, because the president was going to be responsible for executing all those laws that Congress had passed. And then Article 3 being the judiciary. And so as part of that, when we began to implement the Constitution, on April 6th in 1789, the Senate appointed a sergeant at arms, and the next day, a secretary of the Senate. And those are the two positions that still exist that run the non-legislative processes of the US Senate. George Washington was inaugurated in August of that year. You know what that means? It means we've had a sergeant at arms in the US Senate longer than we've had a president of the United States. So at any rate, the first one was James Mather, April 1789, and he had 3 tasks. He had to watch the door, which is the origin of the security and law enforcement role for the sergeant at arms. He had to procure firewood, which we actually still do, because there are historic fires in the US Capitol where people like to have fires in the wintertime. And he had to watch the horses, which we no longer do, but are responsible for the vehicle fleet, the motor pool, the shuttle bus, parking enforcement, et cetera. I figured James Mather probably had a couple stable boys to help him muck out the stalls, and he would be astounded today to see that there are 1,000 people who work in the US Senate Sergeant at Arms. We have the work roles fall into a couple of buckets. One is watch the door. And in fact, my full title was Sergeant at Arms and Doorkeeper of the US Senate, which does not fit on any form you'll ever be asked to fill out. And so continuing to watch the door, but also the evolution of other law enforcement and security roles, emergency preparedness, life safety, continuity of government, physical security, personal security, residential security, and not just for the US Capitol and the 3 Senate office buildings and campus in Washington, D.C., but also for the 450 state offices that senators have around the country. The Sergeant at Arms is responsible for those. The Sergeant at Arms is also the protocol officer for the Senate, so escorting heads of state, managing head of state visits, as well as any kind of Senate ceremonies and funerals. And then back to the firewood and the horses, most of the support services that allow the Senate side of the legislative branch to operate are managed by the Sergeant at Arms, whether that's the post office, the barber shop, the print plant, graphic designers, the media galleries, the television studio, the emotional support counselors. It all falls under the Senate Sergeant at Arms. I think the one that would shock James Mather the most is that over a third of the Sergeant at Arms staff falls under the CIO, Chief Information Officer, or the CISO, the Chief Information Security Officer, because of course he couldn't have imagined the computer networks that we manage today, let alone telephones. So everything from telephones on desks, the devices that are fielded to senators and staff, cybersecurity, web portals, development of applications, data centers, et cetera, all of that falls under the Senate Sergeant at Arms. I was a little concerned going into the role about the political nature of the environment I was entering. As a military officer, serving in a very nonpartisan way, this was very new to me. And it was one of the things I had some of the greatest misgivings about. And it was tricky, and I would be lying if I said I didn't stub my toes a couple of times, but I never stepped into any minefields. And frankly, what I truly appreciated was in the US Senate, that while Senator Schumer and Senator McConnell, the majority and minority leaders during my 4 years there, had very differing legislative agendas, they both asked exactly the same thing of me. And so I never found myself caught between Democrats and Republicans in the Senate. That was a tremendous relief. I think that was due in part, to, again, they really had the same expectations of me, and frankly, their staffs collaborated very, very professionally and very well throughout my tenure there. And again, that was a great relief. I was often asked, who did you work for there? Who is your boss? And I would say, well, I support 135 small independent businesses that each do exactly what they want. That being the 100 senators and 35 committees. Because truly, one of the things I learned is there is no one in charge. And sometimes you see that when you watch the news. There is no one in charge. But that's the way it was designed to be. I did have some principal stakeholders who I was chiefly responsible for, or with whom I received direct guidance on how to perform my role. Specifically, the majority and minority leaders, Senator Schumer and his staff, and Senator McConnell and his, representing their respective, conference and caucus. I also had to respond to the PPT, the President pro tempore. First, it was Senator Patrick Leahy, then Senator Patty Murray. That's who swore me into the role and technically would sign my leave form, although they delegated that authority to me. I was also responsible to the chair and ranking member of the Rules and Administration Committee, very powerful, that really manages how the Senate's going to do its business every day. And then the Appropriations Committee, who decides how much money everybody's going to be. And then specifically there, the Ledge Branch Appropriations Subcommittee. It was a fascinating environment, quite different from working in the executive branch. Again, I've mentioned there's no one person in charge like there is in the executive branch. And I had 135 different entities that I really needed to satisfy and meet their needs, and sometimes thread the needle to provide solutions that were acceptable to the majority of them, because you're never going to please everybody. But it was deeply rewarding. And I found that some of the things, although I never got to jump out of any airplanes, I did get to ride in helicopters, and I didn't get to run in formation or go to the rifle range, although I probably could have with the Capitol Police now that I think about it. But what I found was the things I most missed about the Army, and particularly working together with men and women as a team who are a cohesive, motivated team, all trying to do the right thing every day. That was just the same as I had experienced in the military. And that's probably what I found most deeply rewarding.
You were the only second woman to hold this job in its 232-year history. What was it like to establish your credibility as a female leader in an environment that had been dominated by men for centuries?
Yes. Well, I'm not going to lie. I was surprised at the trepidation I felt going into the role, but I think I'd go back and reflect, or begin with, my early military experience, which was much the same. My first assignment in the Army was in Alaska, Fort Richardson, Alaska, specifically the 6th Infantry Division, which was a light division. And it was heavily, heavily, heavily male. The female officers at Fort Richardson, Alaska, would meet together about once a quarter in the officers' club for lunch, and we could all fit around one round table. People would kind of look at us askance, wondering what we were plotting, but we were very few and far between. In my first job as a second lieutenant, I was a platoon leader. It's a very typical job for a brand new officer. I was responsible for 30 people, and all but one of them were men. And that shouldn't matter, but in that environment, particularly in a very physically demanding, harsh environment of Alaska, it did. So I'm in charge of 30 people. All but one of them are men. All but one of them are older than me. And even the 19-year-old has more experience in the Army than I do. And yet I'm in charge. Very intimidating. The first time I had to counsel a sergeant first class on his shortcomings, on how he had failed to meet some kind of standard. This was probably my second month. I felt like I was chastising my grandfather. He was so old. He was so much older. He was probably 35. I thought, this man is just ancient. And yet, that's what you do. And leadership is a skill, like many others, that you hone and improve throughout your career. I would say things really changed for me. Took a sharp turn about 2.5 months into my assignment in Alaska. They sent me to Northern Warfare School, the winter phase at Fort Greely, Alaska, smack dab in the middle of the state where, get down to 50 below without the wind chill. And so we were skiing, we were snowshoeing, we were building and sleeping in our own snow caves. And the culminating exercise for this 2-week course, and I was the only woman, the culminating exercise was to do a 10-kilometer combat biathlon. Now, you may have seen the biathlon as a winter sport in the Olympics. They wear these lycra suits, very thin, very, very sleek, and they carry a 22 caliber rifle that's so light, you can toss it into the air because, of course, they don't want any extra weight. In the combat biathlon, we wore all our combat gear. You had, it started with a Kevlar helmet, all your military gear, your big clunky army boots, 25-pound ruck, and an M16A1 rifle. And we didn't ski on these little light racing skis. They were 4-inch wooden skis with metal edges for heavy backcountry mountaineering, so tall I could really not even touch the tip of them. And what I didn't tell anybody was that growing up in Montana, my winter sport was Nordic skiing. I had grown up skiing 6 days a week. And on the 7th day, we would gather in someone's garage to wax our skis, but I didn't tell anybody. So I'm the only woman. We go around. Oh, and so in this 10-kilometer biathlon, you're skiing with all this gear, all this heavy stuff, very physically demanding. And then about 3 times on the course, you'll drop to your knees, throw your ruck in front of yourself, and with a rifle, engage the target and hopefully, score some bullseyes. And at the end of this graduation exercise, I beat everyone but one, a guy from California who'd also grown up skiing. And at our graduation, Lieutenant Colonel George Vikalis, 1st of the 17th Infantry, went over to one of his company commanders, an infantry company commander, premier position for a young officer in the Army, and unpinned the crossed rifles on his collar and gave them to me. And I still have them in my jewelry box to remind me that once I demonstrated competence, people would stop worrying about which bathroom I was going to use. And I often tell young people, I say, if you are working for someone who's more concerned about the color of your skin, who your partner is, or where you grew up, what religion you are, what bathroom you use, then what you bring to the table, you need to be thinking about working for someone else, because there are plenty of good leaders out there who prize competence above all those other qualities. So at any rate, I was really kind of the last time I worried about gender, frankly, in the Army. There were times when I might be nervous about, whether I was prepared to fill a role, but that was really the last time I worried about being a woman. Now I'm Senate Sergeant at Arms. I felt exactly like a second lieutenant again. Here I am, 56-year-old woman, lots of leadership under my belt, former 3-star general in the Army, but I'm the senior law enforcement official. Never been to the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. I've never carried a badge. I've never arrested someone. How am I going to earn the respect of these police officers that I'm now responsible for if I've never filled their roles? It was remarkable how much it felt the same. On my 10th day on the job, Officer Billy Evans was killed at the North Barricade of the U.S. Capitol. And, it's quite horrific for him and the Capitol Police. This is right on the heels of January 6th. They are still a very morally devastated force. And I saw officers in the building just openly crying. So once the dust had settled, we kind of returned to normal operations with the exception of the flags at half staff. It's still the same day. I walked around the outside of the Capitol, the perimeter, and approached each of the officers who were manning various posts and expressed my condolences and my appreciation for the work that they did. And a few days later, an officer at Evans hearse went by on Second Avenue in DC, just west of the Capitol. I stood on the curb with the other police officers and, saluted his hearse. It was sincere. And I found that this sincere demonstration of compassion and concern and mutual respect for these officers and what they did accelerated my acceptance by the force. And that once I began to demonstrate competence, was again back to the time in the Army, that people really, what most people prize above all else, or should, is competence and respect. And I think that's really largely how it went.
Now, when you accepted the job, you weren't seeking a full-time job. Yet you stayed in the position for 4 years. What is it like then after 4 years to have to leave? Because you had no choice, did you?
Well, there's two ways to answer that question. One, you're right, I had no choice. I was a political appointee. Senator Schumer selected me. And so when Senator John Thune became majority leader, one of the perks of being the majority leader is you get to pick your own team. And I knew, you're not going to keep someone who was appointed by someone of the opposing party. But I had planned for a year and not told him. I knew it was my last year, regardless of the election outcome. I just didn't tell my staff, because you certainly don't want to be a lame duck or someone, that folks think is not going to be around. And as the final weeks approached, even though I'd been planning for a year, which is how I was even speaking with you, Patricia, planning for a year for what am I going to do when I leave the Senate, I experienced this roller coaster of emotions. In the morning, I'd be marking the calendar like a prisoner, putting the little X in. Oh, thank God, only one more Capitol Police Board meeting. And then at noon, I'd be like, I'm going to miss the cafeteria. I mean, it was just crazy. And I recognized that I was going through what I've now dubbed deployment withdrawal syndrome, because I felt the same way when I left Iraq, Afghanistan, Djibouti, eager to get back to my family, eager to have more free time, eager to be back in the United States, but yet knowing how desperately I was going to miss this team and this mission that I'd poured my heart and soul into. And it was, again, much like when I left the Army, even though I chose to leave the Army at the time that I did, it was very bittersweet. My identity was so wrapped up in being a soldier. And in fact, when I had to turn in my gear, you have to turn in all the equipment that's been issued to you, I really did not want to part with my body armor. I had purchased my helmets. Previous assignments, I had lost them and had to pay for them. So I still have 2 helmets that I got to keep. But I was so relieved when I went through the central issue facility and they said, oh, you can keep your body armor. You just have to take out the Kevlar plates that make it bulletproof and turn those in. So I have pride of place for my body armor. And it was much the same leaving the Senate. I just, it kind of, even though I'd planned for so long, it kind of tore at my heart to have to leave. And so I was deeply, deeply touched when at my last Capitol Police Board meeting, the chief of police presented me with a retired badge for sergeant at arms, and I haven't had to use it yet, but I've heard that if you put it in the bottom of, you put your wallet with your driver's license in the bottom of your purse. And if you get pulled over as you're taking things out to get to your driver's license, if you put this on the dashboard, I've heard it might make a difference. I haven't had to use it yet, but I can tell you that much like my body armor, getting to keep my badge as the senior law enforcement official of the U.S. Senate meant more to me than any plaque or picture or anything else that someone could have given me. It's very difficult to leave when you have such deep affection for your coworkers and have been involved in work that provides such meaning and purpose in your life.
You did tell me, though, your right-hand assistant was nominated to have your job.
Yes.
So
my chief of staff.
In good hands.
Yes, my chief of staff, my former chief of staff, and I had recommended her. Not that it mattered, because the Thune team was going to do whatever they wanted to do. That's their right. But she was my recommendation, and she's the one that was selected, and she's doing a fantastic job.
Good. Now, before you take our questions, what predictions do you have for the Senate, especially in its interactions with the new presidential administration? And now we've had a few weeks' experience. So your comments before we open it up, and I will ask my first personal question after that.
I think, we've had 8 weeks now. And when you and I spoke about this, we didn't know how things would unfold. I think we're certainly kind of seeing that. I've mentioned that when the founders, when they drafted the Constitution, envisioned that the legislature would be the most powerful branch of the government. And I think that's no longer the case. And that's actually predates this administration. I think that Congress, the Senate specifically, has allowed some of its power to erode over decades. One would be only the legislature can declare war. And we have not declared war since Pearl Harbor. Yet look at all these conflicts that our armed forces have been deployed to, so in combat operations. So that perhaps is a power of the legislature that they've not really exercised. And even when I was, as the sergeant at arms, I sat in the gallery when the Senate voted to end, it wasn't a declaration of war, but it was called AUMF, Authorized Use of Military Force in Iraq, that was passed in the wake of 9/11. We only ended that in 23. I can't recall exactly which, I could look it up, but I was in the seat at the time. It took that long for the Senate to end the authorized use of military force in Iraq following 9/11. Some other areas I think to watch the balance of power is, that when even the most controversial cabinet nominees with perhaps some questionable qualifications are confirmed, that is also an indicator of the strength or weakness of the power that the Senate has in the Constitution that they may or may not be choosing to wield. Now, that said, if someone withdraws from nomination, like Matt Gaetz did, and I think there have been a couple others recently, that can be a result of some strong signaling from the Senate that they're not going to pass. So I'm speaking very generically now, but if every nominee is confirmed and you have the same party in power as the White House, it doesn't necessarily mean that the Senate's not doing their job. If you see that people are withdrawing, that can be a sign that that nominee would not have made it through. And then I think another key area to watch in terms of that balance of power between the legislative branch and the presidency, the executive branch right now, is the expenditure of funds. When Congress passes something like the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, and says this money is to be used for these purposes, if that money is not spent in that way, it may fall to the courts to decide the constitutionality of some of those decisions. But the power of the purse is, in fact, one of Congress's greatest powers. And so I think that's another area to really watch closely